It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by AgileDad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started.
I was on a coaching gig not too long ago, and I had a client ask me, we'll just call the client ABC Box Company because it's not really who it was. But they asked me, I said, hey, they said, we were glad we brought you out. It was a first time engagement with them. They said, we're doing Scrum. I said, okay. They said, we've tweaked it a little bit to make it more ours and to take ownership. It is, of course, it's okay for you to tweak or change Scrum, right? I said, yeah. I said, I've seen people adapt it a little bit to meet their specific needs. I said, well, what kind of examples do you have of some of the things you've done? First I asked, how do you know you're doing Scrum? And they said, well, we have everything broken into 2-week sprints. I said, okay, that's good. All of our work's broken down. They said, and we've been doing that meeting every day. I said, oh, okay. So daily Scrum. I said, interesting. I said, so what are you proposing to tweak or change? And the first thing they said is, well, retrospectives. We don't believe in those. So we're just not going to have those because we're not getting a lot of value out of them. So we're just going to go ahead and dump the retrospective. I'm like, okay. Then the person said, the daily Scrum, we do it every day, but I don't know that it's providing as much value as we'd like for it to, because everyone's just saying the same thing over and over anyway. So I think we're going to cut it back to like 2 times a week or 3 times a week. And, we tried at one point using sprint goals, but we really didn't get our head around it. We didn't understand it. So we're going to stop doing that altogether. Our goal should be just to finish things that we put in a sprint, right? And then we're going to have to change the definition of done during our sprint to make sure that we can map what we're doing to the definition of done based on the type of work we're being asked to do. And then, of course, we're not going to do demos for anyone. We're going to go ahead and skip the review and retro altogether because those obviously aren't adding value. So we'll just skip those things. And we're definitely not going to have a vision and strategy or product goal because we need direction, but we don't need that level of direction. We need it to be at sprint level. And finally, we're going to make sure everything we do includes an extensive definition of ready so we can go through checkpoints and checklists to make sure everything's done before we start working on it. I do want to point out that if you follow this mentality, if you hear me say all these things, as long as you don't take them out of context, this is not Scrum. What I just read to you was a list from someone who was upset about Scrum. And they tried to change all these things. And in the end, they're not doing Scrum. I would argue they're not even doing Agile anymore. I mean, just because you do 2-week iterations or just because you meet together daily does not mean that you're Agile. It doesn't mean that you're doing things the best way you can. So it's not us. I want to make sure you understand it's not coming from a place of negative judgment, but it's coming from a place of, yes, it's one thing to experiment, but there's some core things that you really shouldn't mess with that just need to be steady on every single team that practices Scrum. So Scrum only works in its entirety, I guess the easiest way to explain it. It's not a pick and choose, red pill, blue pill, bits and pieces kind of approach. You have to do all the different pieces in order for it to be effective. And if you're not doing all the pieces, I know it's going to shock you, but chances are it's not going to be effective. Wow. So you do the pieces, it's effective. You don't do them, it's not. It's pretty simple. And, Ken was clear to point that out. He says, Scrum was never intended to be complicated. It was meant to be simple to understand, but sometimes it's hard to implement because people have to make serious cultural adjustments and serious adjustments to the way they're doing things in order to effectively do an Agile or Scrum layout and implementation. So is it possible to only do parts of Scrum? It's possible. Is it going to put you in a good place? I can assure you it won't, but it's possible. I'm not going to argue over that. But the result in the end, if you only do bits and pieces, just isn't Scrum. Now, I had another question that came to me. Can you add to it? Now, that's a more interesting question, meaning that Scrum was intended to be a framework. So if you're trying to tweak and build around it and using Scrum as the core, the center, then yeah, sure, you can build around it. I don't see why not, as long as you're not defeating the core tenet of what Scrum is. So instead of tweaking Scrum, how about you sit down for a moment and explore the reasons why you're proposing to change what you're doing? So help me understand what's the real reason, what's the real cause that you feel like we need to change what we're doing? Is it that we're spending too much time in meetings? Is it that we don't have a good connectivity with the stakeholders and we're building a wrong product or service? What is causing you to feel like we need to pivot or make adjustments? Is it that we don't have a good team working agreement? We don't understand the scope of what we should be doing in each of these meetings and they're taking far too long. We're spending too much time in meetings or we're having meetings that are redundant, right? We need to understand what's causing the problem, the root cause, and that's going to help us to better determine the rest. Okay. How about this? If you're brutally honest, is Scrum the real problem? Or are you ignoring a different problem with the team and blaming it on Scrum? There are lots of times where it's easier just to say, Agile's the problem. Agile's not working out. Instead of identifying what the real problem is and saying, hey, this is the real problem we need to address. Because sometimes the real problem is not that pretty, right? Sometimes the real problem, it could be an individual on the team that's not a good cultural fit, which is a real problem. Or it could be something more mundane. It could be that the type of work that we're working on right now just isn't enjoyable, but it's necessary. It's things that we have to do to prepare for future commitments or whatever the case may be. There's no wow factor or sexy to what we're building. I've seen that before. Also, you can ask yourself, what problem would changing Scrum solve? What is it going to make possible by changing what we're doing? What is the end dream going to be? If there's an end state, what would the end state be? And I think that that's probably the most important question, because if we understand that the logic behind making a change is that we want to have a more clear product backlog, then making a change probably isn't what we need to do. We probably need to work closely with the product owner to figure out why the team feels like what they're proposing is not easily consumable. So what I'm saying is a lot of this has to do with digesting and understanding the symptom versus addressing the actual problem. And I think more times than not, because it's more convenient or easier for us to address the symptom, we go down that path and we start addressing the symptom. So if the team still feels like they want to tweak or make changes, I'll actually encourage them to try it for a sprint. I know it sounds crazy, but a lot of times I'll be like, okay, I'll make recommendations, but I think that it's important for them to grow and learn and try new things. And they should be able to openly reflect with each other and talk about what worked, what didn't work, what they want to try again. I mean, the concept of a retrospective is incredibly important, and probably the one thing I'd make sure that they don't do without, especially if they're making tweaks. If they're making adjustments, they definitely need to have a retrospective to discuss the impact of those adjustments. Did it have a positive impact? Did it have a negative impact? What happened, and what did we learn as a result of these changes? And I think that experimentation is key, because failure breeds innovation. I'll tell you that right now. But I also don't want people to do catastrophic failure, because I've also seen catastrophic failure lead to real disappointment. So it's important to have balance. And I think that's the key. I think more organizations need to focus on balance and focus on what's working and what's not working for their teams, and tweak the things that need to be tweaked. But don't just go in and say, hey, we're doing this for the sake of doing it. Really get a good understanding why, and make sure that you as an Agile coach or Scrum Master can make the right proposal based on the team's needs. That's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have a topic you want us to discuss, learn more at AgileDad.com. We'd love to hear from you. As always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.